Jake was in the kitchen when I came in. The sound of the door closing behind me echoed through the room, making it clear that we were alone. He turned and our gazes met, intense and unexpected. The air seemed to carry an electricity that I couldn't ignore. "Hi, Jake," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hi," he replied, with that penetrating look that made me feel a mixture of anxiety and curiosity. As I moved around the kitchen, I felt the accidental touch of his hand on mine. It was a shock, as if an electric current had gone through my body, making my heart race. I looked at him, and his eyes gave me back a silent question. "What are we doing?" The tension was palpable, as if we were on the verge of something unknown, but irresistible. I knew it wasn't right, but at that moment, all I could think about was how much I wanted to feel that touch again. I met Jake one sunny afternoon at my friend's house. He was her son, younger than me, but with a presence that immediately caught my attention. We were all gathered in the kitchen, laughing and chatting, when he arrived. He approached the table, and my friend made the introductions. "Mom, this is Clara, my longtime friend," said Jake, holding out his hand to me. When I shook his hand, I felt a warmth run through my body, a sensation I had never experienced before. His eyes met mine, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. It was a strange sensation, disconcerting, but at the same time, irresistible. He had an intense, almost hypnotic gaze that made me look away, feeling my cheeks blush. During that encounter, I realized that Jake was watching me in a way that no other man had ever done before. His eyes followed my movements, and I could feel his presence even when he was on the other side of the room. It was a look full of curiosity and, perhaps, something more. It disturbed me. I was married. I had a stable life with my husband, but I couldn't get Jake out of my head. Over the next few days, I began to think about him more often. Every time I remembered the touch of his hand, his gaze fixed on me, I felt a mixture of guilt and desire. I tried to convince myself that it was just a passing attraction, something that would soon pass. But the more I tried to push these thoughts away, the more they intensified. I remember one night in particular, when I was lying in bed next to my husband. He was sleeping peacefully, while I stared at the ceiling, thinking about Jake. I'm married, but I can't stop thinking about him, I thought, feeling a pang of guilt. That wasn't right. I loved my husband, but there was something about Jake that attracted me in a way I couldn't explain. The next morning, while we were having coffee, my husband mentioned that Jake was coming to visit us again. My heart raced. I knew I had to keep my composure, act normally, but the thought of seeing him again made me nervous and anxious at the same time. When Jake arrived, our gazes met once again, and I felt that familiar warmth run through my body. During the whole time he had been at our house, our gazes had often met, and I could see a complicit smile on his lips. It was as if we were sharing a secret, something no one else knew. I tried to move away, to keep a safe distance, but it was impossible. With each visit, the attraction between us grew stronger. I was torn between guilt and desire, trying to balance these conflicting feelings. My husband didn't suspect a thing, and I tried hard to keep up appearances, but it was getting harder and harder. On one of these visits, while my husband was out in the yard, Jake approached me in the kitchen. Our gazes met, and for a moment, I was paralyzed. He leaned in a little closer, and I could smell his perfume, his breath. My heart was pounding uncontrollably, and I knew we were about to cross a dangerous line. "Clara, I need to tell you something," Jake whispered, his eyes fixed on mine. I swallowed, trying to stay calm. "What is it, Jake?" He hesitated for a moment, as if fighting his own feelings. "I can't stop thinking about you." His words echoed in my mind, and I felt a mixture of relief and panic. He was feeling the same way. But what did that mean? I knew I shouldn't get involved, that it was wrong, but I couldn't help it. "Jake, this is complicated." I started, but he interrupted me. "I know, Clara, but I can't. There's something about you that attracts me in a way that I can't ignore." Our gaze intensified, and I knew we were on the verge of something dangerous. The tension between us was palpable, almost unbearable. I knew I needed to make a decision, but at that moment, all I could think about was the desire I felt for him. And so, between intense glances and accidental touches, the beginning of our irresistible attraction unfolded. I was caught up in a whirlwind of emotions, fighting guilt and desire, trying to find a way out of the situation I found myself in. But at the same time, I knew that once I crossed that line, there would be no turning back. Jake's visits to our house were becoming more and more frequent. It was hard not to notice the growing tension between the two of us. Every time he showed up, my heart raced, and I felt a warmth rise through my body. He seemed to find excuses to be around, and I couldn't help the feeling of anticipation that overwhelmed me. One afternoon, while we were in the living room, I noticed his gaze on me. He maintained eye contact for longer than necessary, and I felt my face heat up. My husband was there, chatting animatedly with Jake about soccer, without suspecting a thing. I tried to concentrate on the conversation, but my mind wandered, imagining what might happen if we were alone. Jake gave me a complicit smile, and I couldn't help but smile back. It was as if we had a secret that no one else knew about. My husband, oblivious to everything, kept talking, and I struggled to keep my composure. Every smile we exchanged was a spark that ignited something inside me, something I knew I had to avoid, but couldn't. One day, while we were preparing dinner in the kitchen, Jake approached me. I was chopping vegetables, and he came to get a glass from the cupboard above my head. His body brushed lightly against mine, and I felt an electric current run down my spine. He whispered softly, almost inaudibly, "Are you all right?" I just nodded, unable to speak. My heart was racing, and I felt he could hear it. Jake pulled away slowly, but the touch of his hand on my shoulder was imprinted on my skin like fire. I knew we shouldn't go through with it, but the attraction was irresistible. The next day, I was in the kitchen again, this time alone. Jake came in and closed the door behind him. "We need to talk," he said in a serious voice. I looked at him, trying to stay calm. "About what?" "About this," he gestured between us. "I know you feel the same way I do." I swallowed. "Jake, we can't do this. I'm married." He took a step forward, reducing the distance between us. "I know, but I can't stop thinking about you. Every time I come here, it's like something pulls me towards you." I felt my defenses crumble. "I think about you too, more than I should. But that's wrong." He raised his hand and touched my face gently. "I know it's complicated, but I can't ignore how I feel." I closed my eyes, feeling the pressure of his fingers on my skin. "We need to keep this a secret. We can't hurt anyone." Jake nodded. "I promise. But please don't push me away." I opened my eyes and stared at him. "I won't push you away, but we need to be careful." He took a step back, respecting my space. "Then let's be careful. But let's not deny what's happening between us." I knew he was right. The attraction was undeniable, and the tension between us was only growing by the day. Keeping it a secret would be a challenge, but the idea of resisting Jake seemed impossible. I just hoped we could keep our emotions under control while my husband was around. The next few days were a mixture of adrenaline and guilt. Every time Jake showed up, I felt my heart racing, and the exchange of glances between us became more intense. I knew we were playing with fire, but the thrill of being close to him was addictive. I just hoped we could carry on without anyone finding out our secret. I clearly remember the day Jake touched me on purpose for the first time. We were in the kitchen, as usual, enjoying a quick moment while my husband was out in the yard. The sunlight streamed in through the window, illuminating the marble worktop where I was chopping vegetables. Jake approached, like someone who wanted nothing, to get a glass from the cupboard next to me. Our arms touched, and I felt an electricity run through my body. It was a brief touch, but full of intention. He didn't flinch, and neither did I. I looked at him, trying to understand what was happening. His eyes met mine, and in that moment, there was a silent understanding. "Did you feel that?" I asked, almost voicelessly. He just nodded, without looking away. Yes, I did. Guilt immediately overwhelmed me, mixed with a desire I had never experienced before. I pulled away a little, trying to catch my breath and regain my sanity. "We can't do this, Jake. This is wrong." Jake stepped forward, reducing the distance between us. "I know it's wrong, but I can't help it. You feel it too, don't you?" I wanted to deny it. I wanted to say no, but the words wouldn't come out. All I could do was nod slightly. He raised his hand, and this time on purpose, touched my face. The warmth of his touch was almost unbearable, and I closed my eyes, trying to absorb the moment. "This can't go on," I muttered, but my voice lacked conviction. "I know," he replied, but he didn't sound convinced either. "But you're stronger than we are." I moved closer to him, smelling his cologne, feeling the closeness of his body. At that moment, nothing else mattered. It wasn't about my marriage, my friend, or the consequences. It was just about the two of us and that moment. His touch intensified, his hands now gripping my waist, pulling me closer. "I need you," he whispered in my ear, and my skin crawled. I couldn't think straight. Guilt and desire were at war inside me. "Jake, please," he interrupted me, placing a finger over my lips. "Don't say anything," and then kissed me softly on the forehead. It was such an intimate gesture that it almost made me cry. I knew we were crossing a dangerous line, but at that moment, I couldn't pull away. "I have to go," I finally said, my voice shaking. "My husband will notice if I take too long." Jake nodded, but didn't move. "I understand, but you should know that I can't stop thinking about you." I left the kitchen, my heart pounding, my mind in turmoil. The guilt was overwhelming, but the desire was uncontrollable. Every time I thought of that touch, of the look of understanding between us, I felt a mixture of emotions that left me even more confused. I got to the yard and saw my husband working in the vegetable garden, oblivious to everything. The guilt came back full force, and I felt awful. How could I be doing this to him? But at the same time, I couldn't stop thinking about Jake, his touch, the desire he aroused in me. That night, I lay next to my husband, but my mind was elsewhere, reliving every moment of the day, every touch, every look. I knew I was on a dangerous path, but I couldn't find the strength to resist. And so, guilt and desire became my constant companions, leaving me on the edge of an abyss from which I didn't know if I wanted to or could escape. The unexpected encounter in the kitchen happened one afternoon while my husband was out. I was absent-mindedly preparing a snack when I heard the door open. I turned and saw Jake walking in with that smile that always disarmed me. My heart raced. I hadn't expected to see him, but at the same time, a part of me longed for these furtive moments. "Hi, what's up?" he said in a calm voice, but it carried something else, a tension in the air that only the two of us could perceive. "Hi, Jake. How are you?" I replied, trying to keep my composure. But the closeness was unbearable. Every time he came closer, The air seemed denser, charged with an electricity that I couldn't explain. As we talked, he came even closer. I could feel the warmth of his body, the smell of his cologne. Our gazes met, and at that moment, there were so many unspoken things between us. Guilt, desire, uncertainty. It was all there, in a single glance. Then it happened. It was a sudden, overwhelming kiss. He leaned in, and before I could process what was happening, our lips met. It was as if the world had stopped. I felt an electric current run through my body, leaving me breathless. My hands were shaking as I gripped the counter to keep from losing my balance. "I'm sorry," he murmured, pulling away slightly, but his eyes were still fixed on mine, full of desire and regret. I don't know what we're doing," I managed to say, my voice a whisper. I was torn between overwhelming guilt and the uncontrollable desire growing inside me. He held my face with both hands, his fingers caressing my skin. "I don't know either, but I can't stop thinking about you. I knew it was wrong. I was married. I had a life built around my husband. But at that moment, all I could think about was how I wanted to taste Jake's lips again, the feel of his arms around me. I think about you too," I admitted, finally letting the words escape. "But that can't happen, Jake. It's wrong." He sighed, lowering his head for a moment before looking at me again. "I know it's wrong, but I can't help it. What about you?" I couldn't answer. My mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. I wanted to push him away, but my body was screaming for more, and it was this need that made me make the impulsive decision to continue. I moved closer to him again, our bodies touching, and our lips met once more, this time with even greater intensity. I felt alive, seized by a passion I hadn't experienced for years, but at the same time, guilt consumed me. It was as if I was split in two, one part of me wishing it had never started, and the other unable to stop. When we finally pulled away, we were both panting. Jake looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of emotions that I knew well. "Let's try to keep this a secret," he said, his voice low and full of determination. "I don't want to ruin your life, but I can't stay away from you." I nodded, not sure how to respond. I knew I was entering a dangerous path, but it was as if I had no choice. The attraction between us was irresistible, and every moment without him seemed unbearable. "I know," I finally replied. "I feel that way too. We just need to be careful." Jake smiled, a smile that was both sad and full of hope. "We'll make it," he said, holding my hand for a moment before walking away. As he left the kitchen, I felt an emptiness come over me. I knew that nothing would be the same from that moment on. And despite the fear and guilt, I couldn't deny the excitement I felt at the thought of the next meeting, the next kiss. The line between right and wrong was blurring more and more, and I didn't know if I could ever go back. That first forbidden kiss was the start of something I knew was dangerous, but at the same time, impossible to resist. And even though guilt weighed heavily on my heart, I knew I would continue, because somewhere deep inside me, I craved more of those furtive moments with Jake. The text messages between Jake and me became more and more daring. Every notification on my cell phone made my heart race. It was as if we were playing a dangerous and exciting game, where words turned into imaginary touches. One afternoon, while my husband was at work, I received a message from Jake. "I'm coming over. Can it be now?" My heart raced, and without thinking twice, I replied, "Yes." He arrived quickly. He came in through the back door of the kitchen as if it was the most natural thing in the world. "Hi," he said with a smile that made my stomach turn. "Hi," I replied, trying to keep my composure. But the tension between us was palpable, almost suffocating. We moved closer and closer. Jake leaned against the kitchen worktop, and I stood in front of him, with only a few centimeters separating us. "Have you been thinking about me?" he asked, with a mischievous glint in his eyes. "Every day," I confessed, feeling my face heat up. We exchanged intense glances that said more than any words could express. He reached out and gently touched my face. "I can't get you out of my head," he murmured, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. Our secret meetings in the kitchen and in the corridors of the house had become a dangerous habit. Every time we heard my husband's car coming, adrenaline rushed through our veins. "He's almost here," I'd whisper, and we'd quickly separate, adjusting our clothes and trying to look nonchalant. Despite the guilt that sometimes consumed me, the forbidden pleasure became more and more addictive. I shouldn't be doing this, I told myself, but every message from Jake, every touch, every kiss made me want more. "We need to stop," I told him one day, trying to sound convincing. "Then stop," he replied, pulling me closer. And I couldn't. One evening, while my husband was out, Jake appeared at the kitchen door. "I needed to see you," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Me too," I replied, unable to hide the desire in my eyes. We kissed right there, without fear of being caught, and the passion between us was like fire. The sensation of adrenaline and danger only increased the intensity of our encounters. "We're crazy," I said, laughing nervously as we heard my husband's car approaching. "Maybe, but I can't stop," Jake replied, and I knew he meant it. I couldn't stop either. Every meeting, every message, every touch became an addiction. "What are we doing?" I asked in my thoughts, but the answer was too clear to ignore. We were indulging in clandestine pleasure, and the sensation was as intoxicating as it was terrifying. The encounter at the kitchen table during a weekend lunch was one of the riskiest occasions Jake and I had faced. The sun was shining outside, and the scent of home-cooked food filled the air. I was wearing a simple dress, but one that made me feel confident. Jake arrived and, as usual, greeted my husband with a friendly smile. I tried to look calm, but my heart was racing. "Can I help you with anything?" Jake asked, his eyes watching me with an intensity that only the two of us understood. "Sure. Can you get the plates?" I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. His every move seemed orchestrated to provoke me, even if he was just picking up plates. As we stood in the kitchen, alone for a brief moment, our gazes met. The tension was palpable. The adrenaline of being discovered at any moment only increased our desire. Jake moved closer, and for a moment, his hands brushed mine. "We need to stop this," I muttered, but my voice lacked conviction. He smiled sideways, a smile that always left me breathless. "Do you really want to stop?" he asked, his eyes penetrating mine. I knew the real answer was in my eyes, even if my words said otherwise. When we returned to the table, we exchanged complicit smiles, while my husband chatted animatedly about some work project. Every time I looked at Jake, I felt a mixture of guilt and desire. It was a constant internal battle, but the adrenaline of hiding our secret only made it more intense. During lunch, the tension was almost unbearable. I could feel Jake's gaze on me, and every time our eyes met, it was as if the world stopped for a moment. My husband didn't suspect a thing, totally oblivious to the whirlwind of emotions going on inside me. After lunch, while my husband was in the living room, Jake offered to help me wash the dishes. I accepted, knowing it would be another risky moment. In the kitchen, he approached me, standing so close that I could feel his body against mine. Our gazes met again, and the tension was almost tangible. "We're playing with fire," I whispered, my voice full of desire and fear. "Then let's burn together," he replied, before pulling me into a quick but intense kiss. Adrenaline was coursing through my veins. Every touch, every look, every whispered word fueled our desire and made it harder and harder to hide the attraction. When my husband entered the kitchen, we quickly moved away, acting as if nothing had happened. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, without suspecting a thing. "Yes, we're just finishing up," I replied, trying to sound casual. Jake just smiled, as if everything was normal, but I knew he felt the same tension as me. That afternoon was a reminder of how we were walking a tightrope, one step away from being found out. But at the same time, the adrenaline of hiding our clandestine relationship only made us want more. Every encounter was a risk, but a risk we were willing to take. When Jake left, my heart was still racing. I looked at my husband, feeling the guilt consume me, but at the same time, the memory of Jake's touch still burned on my skin. I knew we needed to be more careful, but the truth was that the adrenaline of the risk only increased our desire. We were playing a dangerous game, and it was getting harder and harder to hide. The first time we spent a night together while my husband was traveling was something I never imagined would happen. Jake was home for a casual dinner, as he occasionally did. But that day, my husband had to travel for work. I knew it was dangerous, but the attraction between us had become almost unbearable. After dinner, we sat in the living room, exchanging glances that said more than any words could. My heart was pounding, and the tension in the air was palpable. Jake looked me in the eye, slowly moving closer. I knew I shouldn't, but I couldn't move away. He took my hand and asked, almost in a whisper, "Are you sure you want to do this?" I knew the answer before he even finished his question. "Yes," I replied, my voice trembling with desire and fear. He pulled me closer, and our lips finally met. The kiss was intense, charged with a passion that had been repressed for far too long. We went to my room, each step making me forget a little more about my husband, about my real life. At that moment, all that existed was Jake and the overwhelming desire we felt for each other. As we lay in bed, the intensity of the passion made me forget everything. Every touch, every kiss, every caress seemed to set my body on fire. I had never felt so alive. "You're amazing," Jake whispered in my ear. I moaned, lost in the pleasure he was giving me. The night passed like a blur of intense, forbidden sensations. I knew we were crossing a line of no return, but I couldn't stop. I didn't want to stop. When we finally lay down exhausted, I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and fear. The constant fear of being discovered was still there, but at that moment, it seemed distant, almost irrelevant. I was living an irresistible fantasy, something I never thought possible. "This is wrong," I muttered, more to myself than to him. Jake pulled me closer, his eyes fixed on mine. "But it doesn't feel wrong," he replied. And in a way, he was right. At that moment, in his arms, everything felt exactly as it should. The next morning, when I woke up next to him, reality began to seep in again. The fear of being found out returned in full force. "We need to be careful," I said, my voice shaking. "I know," Jake replied, stroking my cheek. "But I can't stay away from you." I sighed, knowing he was right. The uncontrolled passion between us was something that couldn't be ignored. Even with all the risk, even with the guilt I felt, I knew I couldn't stop. I was caught in this web of desire and fear, and there was no escape. When Jake finally left, I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling. The guilt was overwhelming, but the memory of last night was still vivid in my mind. I knew I was playing a dangerous game, but I couldn't pull away. The passion between us was like a flame that couldn't be extinguished. I stood up, trying to put my thoughts in order. I needed to act normally, to pretend that everything was fine. But deep down, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. I was living a fantasy, yes, but reality was relentless. The fear of being found out was always there, a constant reminder of what was at stake. But at that moment, as I looked in the mirror, all I could think about was Jake. And I knew that, despite all the risks, I wouldn't be able to stop. The uncontrolled passion between us had become a part of me, something I wasn't willing to give up. Even though I knew I was playing with fire, I couldn't resist the flame. After so many nights of passion and forbidden encounters, something unexpected began to emerge between Jake and me. It wasn't just physical desire that united us, but something deeper, more intimate. One night, after another escapade, we were lying side by side on the cold kitchen floor, our breath still panting. I looked at him and said, "Jake, what are we doing with our lives?" He turned his head and faced me, his blue eyes shining in the dim light. "I don't know, but I do know that I can't stay away from you." The sincerity in his voice touched me deeply. For the first time, I felt that it wasn't just a physical attraction. There was an emotional connection that I could no longer ignore. We started talking, sharing our lives, our fears and dreams. He told me about his plans to travel the world, to experience new cultures. I talked about my years of marriage, about how, despite loving my husband, I felt something was missing. "I never thought I'd get involved like this," he confessed. "But when I'm with you, I feel like I can be myself." Those words echoed inside me. I felt that way too. With Jake, I could be vulnerable. I could show my weaknesses and still be accepted. But this emotional connection only increased my guilt. Every time I looked at my husband, I felt a huge weight on my chest. He trusted me, and I was betraying that trust in a way I never thought possible. "I don't know how we're going to carry on with this," I mumbled, feeling tears gathering in my eyes. "I feel awful, but I can't stop." Jake held my hand, his touch warm and comforting. "I feel guilty too, but I'd rather have these moments with you than nothing at all." And so we decided to continue. We knew the risks, the possibility of being discovered, but the connection between us was too strong to ignore. Every time my husband left the house, I felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. Relief at being able to see Jake again, and anxiety at the constant fear of being caught. One morning, after an intense night, Jake looked me in the eye and said, "I think I'm falling in love with you." My heart raced. I knew I felt something strong for him, but hearing it out loud made it all the more real. "Jake, this is so complicated," I replied, my voice shaking. "I have very strong feelings for you too, but I don't know how to deal with it," he sighed, running his hand through his hair. "I know, but even knowing all the complications, I can't help it." These intimate conversations became an essential part of our relationship. It was no longer just about physical pleasure. It was about understanding and supporting each other on a deeper level. Each encounter became a mixture of emotion and guilt, but the attraction was irresistible. Our clandestine relationship continued, with the guilt growing by the day. I loved my husband, but the connection with Jake was something I had never experienced before. It was a mixture of passion, understanding, and complicity that left me torn between two worlds. The weight of betrayal was crushing, but the thought of breaking up with Jake was unbearable. I knew we were walking a dangerous path, but with every conversation, every touch, every look, it became clearer that we weren't willing to give up. Even knowing the risk, even with the constant guilt, we decided to carry on, living each moment as if it were our last, aware that we were playing with fire, but unable to stop. And so the emotional bond between us grew stronger, making our story even more complex and difficult to break. The routine of secret meetings with Jake became an inevitable part of my daily life. Every text message exchanged, Every furtive glance and every hidden touch nourished us in a way I had never experienced before. It was as if everything around us disappeared when we were together. The adrenaline and excitement were addictive, and I felt alive in a way I hadn't felt for years. One afternoon, while I was in the kitchen preparing dinner, my cell phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a message from Jake. "Can I come by later? I need to see you." My heart raced. I looked at my watch and calculated the time I would have before my husband got home from work. I quickly replied, "Come at 6 p.m. I have an hour." At 6 p.m. sharp, I heard the back door open quietly. Jake walked in, and our gazes met immediately. Without saying a word, he walked towards me, his presence dominating the space. The warmth of his body next to mine made me shiver. "I can't stay away from you," he whispered, his eyes fixed on mine. "Me neither," I replied, my voice breaking. He pulled me close, his hands firmly on my waist. Our lips met with an urgency that seemed to grow with each passing day. The kiss was intense, full of desire and need. It was as if we were trying to capture every moment, knowing that our time was limited. When we finally pulled away, I felt torn. On the one hand, the pleasure of being with Jake was undeniable. On the other, the guilt of cheating on him was ever present. I knew I was cheating on my husband, but at the same time, I couldn't stop. "Are you all right?" Jake asked, his voice soft and concerned. "Yeah, it's just that. Sometimes the guilt is overwhelming," I confessed, looking at him. "I know, but I also know that we can't stop now. What we have is real," he said, holding my face between his hands. And he was right. What we had was real, so real that it seemed impossible to stop. We spent the rest of the hour together, talking, exchanging caresses and whispers. Every moment was precious. Every second, a memory I would treasure. When Jake finally left, I stayed in the kitchen, trying to gather my thoughts. The sound of the door closing behind him brought reality back full force. I looked at the clock again. My husband would be home in 15 minutes. I washed my face quickly, trying to erase any trace of our escapade. When he finally arrived, I was in the kitchen, finishing preparing dinner. He came in smiling, kissed me on the cheek, and asked about my day. The conversation was normal, routine, but inside me, a whirlwind of emotions was unfolding. "How was your day, love?" he asked, picking up a glass of water. "It was good, just a bit tiring," I replied, avoiding his gaze. "You seem a bit distracted lately. Is everything all right?" he insisted, concerned. "Yeah, just work and stuff." "Nothing much," I lied, forcing a smile. This game of lies and secrets was consuming me. Every time I looked at my husband, guilt mixed with remorse. But at the same time, my desire for Jake didn't diminish. It was as if I was living two lives, one during the day and another during the furtive hours I spent with him. The next day, the routine repeated itself. More messages from Jake, more secret meetings. Each time I returned home, I felt torn between pleasure and guilt. But somehow, the betrayal had become an eternal secret, something I carried with me without any final regrets. It was as if I had accepted that this was the new reality of my life. Jake and I kept seeing each other, more and more carefully, but just as much in love. The tension and adrenaline were constant, but we couldn't stop. We were trapped in a cycle of desire and regret, but every moment together made it all worthwhile. I knew I was living a lie, deceiving my husband and betraying his trust. But at the same time, I couldn't imagine my life without Jake. He had become an essential part of who I was, and our attraction was something that couldn't be denied. So I continued to live this duality, torn between love and betrayal, pleasure and guilt. Every day was a new challenge, a new attempt to balance the two parts of my life. And despite everything, I didn't regret a thing. Because, at the end of the day, what I had with Jake was real, and that was what mattered.